All right. Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the God Squad pod, where we expose the fundamentalist fuckwittery and the brazen hypocrisy of Christian nationalists and fundamentalists everywhere in these United States. As almost always, I am joined by the amazing, the talented December Rose, who is back from her trip to Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas, close to my old neck of the woods. How you doing, D?
Doing good. Good to be back with my friend Dylan Amber Cruz, the tattooed theologian on the God Squad. I have missed y'all. It's been a long time. I shouldn't have left y'all without a dope talk to think to. How you doing, Dylan? What's up?
Well, yeah, that's right. Because last week things just went absolutely haywire as I tried to run the show, and it did not go well, and we did not have a show. So for many reasons, I'm glad that December's back, but she does our production while we're on the air, so very grateful for that. But we have a wonderful, wonderful guest tonight that we had to reschedule because he's been on an exhausting book tour, and the first time we tried to do this, he was also in North Texas, and that's Tornado Alley, and there were some storms and some thunder bumpers, and he couldn't get back to New York, so we rescheduled for tonight. And tonight, our guest is the Reverend Brandan Robertson, a noted author, activist, and public theologian dedicated to exploring the intersections of spirituality, sexuality, and social justice. He is the pastor of Sunnyside Reformed Church in New York City and the founder and executive director of the Devout Foundation, known as the TikTok Pastor. Robertson's inclusive theological content reaches over 300,000 followers and has garnered 10 million views. I'm going to pretend not to be jealous. He has acquired a Bachelor of Arts in Pastoral Ministry and Biblical Studies from Moody Bible Institute, a Master of Theological Study from Iliff School of Theology, and a Master of Arts in Political Science and Public Administration from Eastern Illinois. My goodness. And he's currently pursuing... What's that?
I said, in other words, this guy might know a little bit about a little bit.
Yeah. And he is currently pursuing a PhD in biblical studies at Drew University, which is in New Jersey. And we would like to welcome Reverend Brandan Robertson to the God Squad pod. Thank you so much, Brandan, for joining us. And
it's such an honor to be with you all. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We are delighted. And we're here to talk about your fantastic book. If I can get that out of the light. Queer Christian, Reclaiming the Bible, Our Faith, and Our Place at the Table.
Yeah,
and as y'all can see, my copy has lots of little flags and lots of stars and squiggly lines all over it because there's just a wealth of biblical information in this book. And I'm very grateful. I wish I had a book like this in 1992 when I was still a Southern Baptist and got told that there was a gay agenda and that the gays were why the Roman Empire fell and, that they were going to bring about the downfall of America and all that sort of foolishness.
Well, I have to say, I was born in 92, not to date everybody, but and I do think the gays might be the reason the Roman Empire fell, but we can talk about that later.
Were they doing all the farming and all the warring and all the everything? Is that why?
Gays run the society and they can take down a society in good ways.
There you go. Well, like I said, I read this a couple weeks ago in prep for the show, and right away, you make no bones about what you're about, and this might freak some people out. But you're talking about queering Christianity on every topic and a queer revolution. So, Brandan, what does that look like for you?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a decade-long journey to write this book. I didn't want to write this when my publisher asked me because I've written other books on being gay and Christian and how to reconcile your faith and sexuality. And so I kind of begrudgingly sat down to write this book 2 years ago. But as I started writing it, I realized that, it needed to do the things that a book like this does, which is like go through the clobber passages and help show people how they can reconcile LGBT identity and Christianity. But I also found myself saying things that I had never articulated before, namely that the problem has never been 6 Bible verses that have been misinterpreted. but the entire paradigm of Orthodox Christianity, so-called Orthodox Christianity, I think that is from the ground up where all of this toxic theology comes from, not just on LGBT issues, but on virtually every social issue and many of the theological issues. It's rooted in an image of God that I don't believe is real or helpful. It's rooted in an understanding of a Bible that isn't real and doesn't align with what the Bible actually is. And so this book became way more than just how to be queer and Christian, but how to empower people, straight and LGBT alike, to queer Christianity. And I'll say, I use the word queer here in the way Bell Hooks uses it, and I quote her in the first chapter. She says, being queer is not so much who you're having sex with, but rather being at odds with everything and everyone around you and having to create a space to think and thrive and live. I think the gospel calls us to resist all of the forces in religion and society that are trying to conform us into something that is other than who we are. And I think at the heart of the gospel is a call to reclaim our authentic identities, embrace each other's authentic identities, and resist every system and structure, even those that are called holy or orthodox, that are forcing people to be other than who God created them to be.
Yeah, that broader definition of queer really comes out in the book, and it was almost a little unsettling to read that broader definition, but I couldn't initially figure out why. And then as I went through the book, I was like, oh, okay, I can see Brandan's perspective here, because the gospel is countercultural, so countercultural, and in its original historical context. And now we're 2,000 years later, and we still have to be countercultural if we're going to be even remotely faithful to what Jesus taught. Yeah,
exactly. And to your point, and to the comment I just see right there, I'll just say, like, the invitation of this book became for straight people and queer people alike to be queered, right? Queering goes back to queer theory, which is over 50, 60 years old. And that wasn't actually related to LGBT people when it started. Queer theory was this idea of resisting all forms of conformity and norms. And as you said, that is the countercultural nature of the gospel Jesus preached. I think that got lost when Constantine declared Christianity the religion of the empire. And really for 1,500 years, we've not had a dominant form of Christianity that has embraced the radical countercultural queerness that I think Jesus intended. And I think in a moment where Christian nationalists have all the power, if we're going to have any form of Christianity, it better be a queered Christianity.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, for those who could be watching this and they might be asking themselves, even after that explanation, what in the world is a queered Christianity? What does that mean? Most people, I want you to go just a little bit deeper than where we've started at, because most people, when they hear the word queer, because of the way society has marketed that word, the way that people have done their best to define what that is for the queer people instead of allowing queer people to define it for themselves, they automatically go to sexual orientation. It's just automatically about that. That's all it is for a lot of people. So please help our listeners, even those that are liberal and progressive in their thinking, still might take issue with the word or the phrase queer Christianity. They're like, why we just can't be Christians? Why I got to be a queer Christian? So please help the brothers and sisters out that might be having their feathers, even the ones that love you and accept you and consider themselves your ally, might have their feathers just a tiny bit ruffled by this idea. Help them understand. I want you to help people to divorce the idea of sexuality from the word queer altogether. Can you help them with that?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as you said it. There are two definitions, and I articulate both of them in the book, that queer is an identity. It's kind of the umbrella catch-all term for the LGBT community. And it's a word that many younger generations of LGBT people have chosen to use. I use it because it expresses more than just the fact that I'm gay, but that the way I live out my entire identity is in resistance to norms. And that can look like gender queerness, that can look like political queerness. And that's kind of actually where the second definition comes in, that I think all of us are invited to consider, is the more political or social usage of the word queer. To be queer at like the basic English level is to be, I think one of the original definitions is odd. It was kind of a derogatory term back in the day, but it began to be reclaimed by those who recognize that oddness or uniqueness or being other than the dominant culture or political identity was actually a good thing and not a bad thing. And that I think this queer theory and queer theology has at its core an intersectional lens, which sees all of the justice issues that we're facing and all of the identities that we have as intersecting with one another. And thus, all of these identities are invited into a posture of queering, or sometimes forced into a posture of queering, accepting the sense that they are other, that they are different, that they are not the dominant, privileged cultural ideal. But again, instead of taking that label on as a bad thing, it's the reclamation and saying, actually, no, it's good that we're not the dominant. It's good that we're not aligned with the power structures. And again, that sounds so much like what Jesus was up to in his opposition to the Roman Empire. It's Jesus could have very easily just conformed to the way of Caesar, and his religious movement wouldn't have ended up in crucifixion and persecution.
Right.
I think we see that with Trump and Christian nationalism. Right now, if you're a white evangelical and you just bow the knee to the right wing, you're getting power and privilege and influence. That's what society does. That's what religion does. What Jesus, I think, is calling us to is to say, that might be tempting for those who are white, straight, cisgender people, but even they are called to reject and resist that and join the rest of us in recognizing that these structures themselves are oppressive, not just to people of color and queer people and immigrants, but they're oppressive to the people that they're even privileging, because it's making the white, straight, cisgender person have to adopt identities that might not be authentic to who they are, and conform to ideas of what a biblical man is or a biblical woman is that might not be authentic to who they are. So I don't know if I actually did that in any succinct, helpful way, but
I think you did. And I went to church on Sunday at a metropolitan community church congregation to watch a friend of mine preach. And he is very beautifully a gay man. But he also, we were having a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the fact that he prefers the word queer because, like you, it's not just about sex and sexuality. It's so much more broad than that. And I think, I don't know that he was looking at it in quite the intersectional way exactly that you were, but definitely in an expansive way, more expansive than most cishet people think of. And the reclamation part of that word, because it was such a pejorative for bigots, I think it's important that queer people can own that. And that's why, even though I have randomly been attracted to men, I am predominantly attracted to women. So I don't say that I'm queer. It almost feels like I would be appropriating the word. But in this countercultural way that you're talking about, particularly under this lens of Christo-fascist Christian nationalism and the MAGA movement, well then, because, no, thank you. I learned all that nonsense in the early 90s, and it was detrimental to me.
Yeah.
I carried that. I owned it. I walked around with a hat that I swear said, I support gun rights and gay control, because one of my Marine Corps sergeants said that. And I thought, ooh, that's very, very clever. And so I went and had a hat made on purpose and wore that stupid fucking hat for about a year. And then it took leaving that world and walking away from it for different reasons but some of which that you touch on in the book, and we'll get to that. For me to be able to have the scales fall from my eyes. So to speak.
Okay. There's a lot of folks walking around with stupid fucking hats right now. So
okay, yes, there are. But we have a question. We have a question from a listener, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. Elaine says, "Do you think people are born queer or non-conformative, or do you think it is shaped through experiences or their society?" And this is one of those debates that has raged on and on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would want to answer this question by removing the word queer for a second. I would use the word lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Are people born those identities? Yes, I think the psychology is generally clear that sexuality and gender identity are generally innate. There is some evidence that there is some nurture component that happens later on in life and teenage years that can shape that in certain ways. But the psychology is pretty clear that LGBT identities, just like heterosexual and cisgender identities, are something that are innate parts of us, meaning that we're born with them. But when you adopt the label queer, like, and this is something you hear even a lot of progressive, as December you mentioned, like, a lot of people are uncomfortable with the word queer because when you adopt that identity as an LGBT person, it is a social identity. It is a political identity. So in that sense, it is something you're choosing. It's a way of posturing yourself in the world. And I would even just want to point out, and this might be going off track a little bit, but there's been a debate this year in the modern LGBT Christian movements. Matthew Vines and the Reformation Project came out about 6 months ago and said, being queer and queer theology is dangerous to the LGBT Christian movement. And the idea there is that half of the movement was just trying to gain acceptance in the traditional Christian church. But those of us who use the word queer are saying, actually, I don't want acceptance in the traditional Christian church. That's not the point. The point is, as I say in the book, to build our own damn table. It's to stop begging for a seat at a table that is not welcoming to us. It's to create new spaces, as Bell Hooks says, to think and thrive and live. And that is a choice. I'm choosing to be oppositional when I'm using the language queer because I'm opposing the dominant systems and structures of our society. So all of that to say, I think the identity queer is a choice in that it's a posture you're choosing as an LGBT person, rather than just being kind of an assimilationist LGBT person that says, I just want to get gay married, have kids, and live the stereotypical American life, or whatever that means.
Yeah.
Right. That's a really helpful distinction. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for your question, Elaine. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Elaine. I want to address something in your book too, because you mentioned earlier that in the light of what you just said here, there's apparently a faction of the queer community that wants to assimilate, and then there's y'all who are like, fuck all y'all, we're gonna do our thing over here. You know what I'm saying? We're done banging on the door, asking for you to make room for us at the table. We're just gonna do our thing authentically. And there's a response. There is a response from the institutional church in general, and then there's a response that you just mentioned from the LGBT, if there's a such thing as conservative LGBTQ community. I think there is. I've met some of these folks. There's a lot of intersectionality in the LGBTQ. I've met some racist folks in the LGBTQ community. I'm like, how are you gonna be racist? Like, the world we're in, you and I ought to be allies. You don't you got enough going on with you? You want to hate on me, But it's there's so many dynamics, right? And there's misogyny within the LGBTQ community, just like any other community. I find, and this is getting a little bit off topic, but I'm going to read something here. One of the issues, and this may not be so much associated with your book, but just the overall queer conversation of things. One of the big things that have become one of the culture war issues is allowing trans people in sports and this and that kind of thing. And what I find that you don't find a lot of trans men, as in people who transition to men, trying to knock down the door to get into men's sports because they know better. And this is my opinion. Let me put that out there before anybody want to try to cancel me. these women, these people who have wombs, who used to be, who are, for all intents and purposes, biologically and chromosomally, or whatever the case, women who decided to transition to affirm themselves in their identity and become men, whatever the case is. Excuse me, so I'm not using the right terminology there. They're not trying to get into the NFL. They're not trying to get into the NBA. They're not trying to run beside men at the Olympics. They're not trying to jump into the swimming pool with men because they know that they can't compete. No matter how many hormones they take, they will not be able to compete with those men. I find it, and this is my personal opinion, let me just put that out there. I find it misogynistic in nature that trans women rather, are in some cases knocking down the door to get into women's sports, but don't have the same mentality that trans men have, knowing they want to force you to accept that they can compete with, and want you to dismiss the fact that they are biologically different than you, that their body reacts different to adrenaline, that their bone structure is different. Everything is different. And I think that there's a place in sports for trans people, but I think we have to be careful. And what I'm getting around to is there are some concerns inside and outside the queer community that do make sense. And I think when we try to dismiss that or counsel that out, we lose ground. We lose the integrity when we try to just say, oh, you're just homophobic. When we throw that word homophobia around too loose. You know what I'm saying? Everybody's not homophobic. Some of this stuff is fucking common sense. There's a bicyclist, I can't remember her name, but she transitioned to a she, and she entered into a cycling contest to prove a point. She won, and then she refused to accept the award. She said, I did this to prove the point. I know I identify as female, but I know that I am superior in strength to all of these women. And I just did it to prove that I don't belong in this sport, racing against them. And I want to prove that to everyone. I'm not accepting the award. And so I say that to say we have to be authentic, but we also have to exist in a way that acknowledges the world as it is, and also demand that the world respects you, but not demand that the world be delusional about you. I hope that's not offensive, and I hope you understand what I'm saying. Go ahead.
I would say I agree in a couple things. One, I think so many of these conversations, not just related to LGBT issues, but so many of our issues right now lack nuance because so many people are fearful of the onslaught that's coming from the right wing. And so it stops people from being able to have the nuanced, complex conversations around something like gender identity, which is a very complex topic. And the only other thing I would say is, and you all might have had her on before, but my friend Paula Williams, a trans woman, wrote a book called As a Woman, which talks exactly about what you're talking about, her journey from being male identified to now being a trans woman, and recognizing the misogyny that women face, and beginning to wrestle with the privilege that she held when she identified as a male and the ways that men don't see all of that. It's a great book. Anybody who wants to actually have a more nuanced conversation about gender identity, Paula Williams, As a Woman. Yeah.
Oh, and I find that they don't, not all, but some of the ones that transition to being a woman, they bring their misogyny with them and they don't see it. They bring it in, and they bring their male misogynist ideology with them into their female body and into the female spaces, but they don't see it. And then they get offended when they get called out on it and call you transphobic when you're not being transphobic. They can't see that they brought their misogyny with them into this female space. But I want to read something, and it's complicated. You know, we're learning ourselves. We're learning how to receive and exist in a complicated world and accept things that we're not used to seeing, and in my position, even celebrate things that I'm not used to seeing or being around. I'm going to read something you have in chapter 3, the boundaries of God's love, something that I thought was interesting and that many people might identify with. You say, yet for the first time, I realized there was a strict boundary line regarding my acceptance in this church. I needed to quell my curiosity and toe the party line regarding doctrine. If I didn't, the welcome and warmth I received would run out. This led me to begin fearing my curiosity and second guessing my own desire to study the Bible. Not only could it cause me to lose my community, but apparently it could put my soul in jeopardy with God as well. The love that drew me to God and the church had for the first time been revealed to be conditional, rooted in fear. Very quickly, I began seeing these boundary lines popping up everywhere. And you go on to talk about that you had fear of being rejected by the church and being condemned to hell for eternity for being your authentic self, which seems antithetical to Christ. Because when you were covering that and not being your authentic self, they would say that you're being a good little Christian, but that was living a lie. And how many people are living that lie, trying to assimilate, and it's canceling out your walk with God for the most part, because God does not require that any of us live in a lie for any reason.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like, it still perplexes me to this day that who would have ever thought evangelical churches, which are all about evangelism, all about bringing people to the Lord, on this issue in particular, they draw a boundary line and say, actually, if you're LGBT, you're not really welcome in our church. You might be welcome to attend worship, but that's about all you can do. And exactly also, as you said, like the biggest hypocrisy I realized as a young teenager wrestling with my sexuality was when I lied about who I was, then the church said I was walking on the straight and narrow holy path. When I am honest about who I am, I'm a heretic, a false teacher, somebody who's walked away. As you said, like that is such a clear evidence that something is not of God when the dishonesty is now made into truth. In fact, I think that's what blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is, kind of. I think the idea that when Jesus talked about that, it's calling that which is not of God, godly, and calling that which is clearly not of God, something good. And I think the church looks at the LGBT community and who wants to be Christians and says, you can't be a Christian. That's an evil, disordered desire. When that is the very part of their understanding of what the gospel calls us to, a desire to follow Jesus. So it's a very perplexing thing that's still happening more and more.
One of the things that has, since I left the fundamentalist world, that has struck me is that they just cannot accept that I was born with blue eyes. I didn't choose to have blue eyes, right? And I was born predominantly straight. I didn't choose that. And Paul even says, look at nature and see the glory of God. And I'm a permaculture guy, and you probably never heard what that is, but it's a system of ecological and social design. And it says that we look at nature for patterns. And when I look at nature, I see diversity everywhere I look. And so it's a ludicrous idea to me that the evangelical gender complementarian idea that you have to be the right kind of man. You can't be Malakoi. Oh no, that you can't do that. You have to be, and there's just two ways of humans to be: male and female, and also straight. And it's just so utterly ridiculous. But one of the important, poignant things in your book is the journey that you underwent because of the world that you were in, that fundamentalist evangelical world, of the attempts at converting yourself to be straight. And I just want to say right up front that conversion therapy is absolute horseshit. There is no science behind it. It's just hate and all of that. But you went through that. And I can't imagine the trauma that caused. But you write about it very, very poignantly in the book. So tell our listeners as much as you feel, that you want to about that journey and what if anything it taught you other than this is some horse shit and I'm gay.
Yeah. I mean, the good news for me is that I went through a version of conversion therapy that was much lighter than what most people hear about if you watch documentaries or see the movies that have come out recently.
Okay.
It doesn't make it less harmful, but I mean, the modality of conversion therapy is rooted. It was this guy named Joseph Nicolosi wrote a book about 50 years ago called Shame and Attachment Loss. And it's kind of the foundational book of conversion therapy, which basically lays out that if a young boy has an overattached mother and a distant or abusive father, they will have what they call gender fracture, and that creates a gay person, a disordered gay desire. And so the conversion therapy methods, in virtually any method, is seeking to heal the overattachment to the mother, heal the wounds of abuse from the father. And if you can heal those traumas, they believe you can create a straight person out of a gay person. And so my conversion therapy, I would meet with an ex-lesbian professor once a week. And essentially we would go through my childhood memories. We would ask God to reveal moments of trauma from my childhood. And we would relive those moments together, but would invite Jesus to show up in those memories. And the idea, again, was that if we could bring Jesus into a traumatic memory, we thus heal the memory and thus would heal my sexuality. So all in all, what was profound for me was that it was actually a helpful thing to walk through my trauma with somebody. And that's the kind of, excuse me, but mindfuck of conversion therapy is it actually, like, part of this is psychologically verifiable, right? It is a good thing in therapy to relive trauma in a safe way and to make it less intense in your memory. That's PTSD therapy 101. So I was experiencing like some version of psychological wellness from talking through all these things I had never talked about before. But by the end of the year, I recognized that while I had experienced healing, and it was a good thing for me to work through some of these traumas, that my sexuality had not changed at all. And that the deeper problem in the conversion therapy was the theology that undergirded it, which was a theology of fear. It was a theology that said, if I ended up choosing to live out my gay identity, that put me in opposition to God. And that put me in opposition to the church. And that made me an enemy of what was good in the world. And that's actually where I think so much of the psychological trauma comes from for most people. It's less about the pseudo-psychology that they might experience, although that can be very traumatic. But it's more the religious pressure that surrounds it that says, if you don't have the outcome at the end of this, that you are now straight or say that you're straight, then there's something wrong with your soul. There's something wrong with you spiritually. And I remember my ex-lesbian professor, when I graduated at Moody, it was 6 months before I launched an organization called Evangelicals for Marriage Equality. And she wrote me, I published it on the internet, the most horrendous letter filled with this deeply spiritual language about demonic, how Satan had gotten a hold of me, how I've been deceived and I'm a deceiver. And that kind of spiritual language is actually what caused me a lot of harm that I'm still working through 10 years later, because that stuff embeds itself in your subconscious. When you hear somebody telling you you are demonic and evil and you've been a deceiver, and imagine if you're a queer young adult or a queer teenager hearing this. Imagine how deep that ingrains inside your identity. And no wonder you see suicidal ideation. No wonder you see people running away from home and ending up experiencing homelessness because they feel like they can't stay in an environment where they're seen as demonic and evil. So my conversion therapy was bad, but I'm grateful it wasn't as bad as some of the others. I've gotten to hear the stories of so many. And the last thing I want to say is part of the project that I've been working on with my nonprofit Devout is looking around the country. Most people don't realize in almost every city in this country, there are about 12 to 15 churches doing conversion therapy. In New York City alone, where I live, there are 20 churches that are doing conversion therapy right now. This is not a minor thing. This is happening everywhere across the country, and people need to know that it's taking place.
Wow, I had no idea that was so prevalent in 2025. I know some states have pushed to make it illegal because it, again, is harmful. And as somebody who's been through many rounds of therapy for PTSD, I can understand how there were aspects of that were helpful to you, because, you know, I didn't even know I had PTSD until I was in my late 30s or late 30s. So, you know, you just kind of swim in the water that you're in, right?
Yeah.
But that spiritual component, and, you know, December and I both grew up in conservative Christian context, and so we can understand some of that, right, on an intellectual level, but not what it would be like to be a gay kid hearing that. And so that was really powerful in your book, and I appreciate your vulnerability in writing about that and sharing about it. And one of the things that just ripped my heart out in your book was when you were with your friend in college, and you shared that first kiss, and you said I think it was something to the effect of, in that moment, I knew who I was, or, you know, like it was like a very seminal sort of moment, but then the fundamentalist fuckwittery got in the way.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
so,
it does almost sound like a fictional story. I promise it's not, but it's a moment that so many people have, of like, we were two queer kids that were in Bible college together, going through conversion therapy together. But of course, we had this attraction that was building up, and eventually it broke into a moment where we did finally kiss years into our relationship. But immediately, because of the religious shame and the fear, I texted my conversion therapist moments after and said, "Hey, this is what just happened." And she responded, "You all need to separate right now." And it began a journey where we separated from each other for nearly 6 months and didn't talk to each other. And like, again, what a fucked up paradigm to tell two young people who are going through a really hard season that because they had a very innocent, intimate interaction, that this was somehow an indictment against our souls, and that we needed to sever relationship immediately because hell was on the other side of this if we didn't. Like, that is what's being taught in a majority of evangelical churches today. And that theology is one of the reasons why so many young people are not going to church anymore, because people recognize it's bullshit that sounds like bullshit. But for the young queer kids like me who had no other place to go, the church was where I escaped abuse at home. The church was where I found community that accepted me. I had no other choice but to conform and to align with them, because they were everything that I had. And that's a really desperate place to end up.
Yeah. Wow. Clobber passages. There are a handful, and you talk about them. And we've talked about them on the show a lot, because I took a class with a world-renowned professor named Julia O'Brien on gender, sexuality, and the Bible when I was in seminary, and we deconstructed them all. As you started to study the Bible more academically, what about those passages stood out to you?
And before you answer that question, not everybody is familiar with that term, clobber passages. Some of our listeners will be hearing that for the first time. So if you could start out with explaining what does that term even mean, and then answer that question, that for our listeners' sake, that would be great.
Yeah, so there are 6 to 8 verses, depending on how you count them, in the Bible that seemingly referred to homosexuality, and in a condemning way. And progressives have tended to call those verses the clobber passages, because they're used to clobber LGBT people into submission. And so these are verses like Leviticus 18:22, which says, "A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, for this is an abomination." These are verses like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. And then in the New Testament, you have Paul's writings in Romans 1, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy. All of the modern English translations use the word homosexual for these passages. What's really simple, I should say, the answer to the clobber passages is incredibly simple. And that's what I realized when I started studying the Bible in seminary, is just with like 10 minutes of studying the culture and context of the ancient world and how they thought about sexuality and gender, you immediately see that all of these verses, the best interpretation among a majority of biblical scholars is that these verses are talking about sexual exploitation of men against men of lower social statuses, which was a very common thing in the ancient Egyptian world, Canaanite world, and Greco-Roman world. In fact, we have tomes of law codes from the first century in Greece and Rome that permit Roman citizen men to sexually exploit anyone who was of a lower social status, male or woman,
including children.
and there was no and children, yes, and there was no legal recourse for anybody because Roman citizen men were true humans, and everybody else was on a degradation of humanity down this social scale. So essentially, that is what every single one of the clobber passages are referring to. And it's actually, as soon as you put that lens on and then go read the verses, if you read around them, there's always a mention of prostitution or sexual exploitation. There's always slavery is mentioned in most of the passages in some form or another. Idolatry is mentioned in almost all of the passages around the so-called verse that condemns homosexuality. So it's very clear all of a sudden that the context of whatever sexual action is being talked about is exploitation, abuse, idolatry, not loving, consensual same-sex relationships.
Yeah. I mean, Leviticus 18 literally starts off by saying who this is for, as you pointed out in the book. And when we covered that passage with Dr. O'Brien, she's like, look, in the original Hebrew, this is not translatable. It's literally not translatable. And another rabbi that Daniel Rittenberg said, if you think you know what that verse means, you don't. And then she's just like, because it's not, because the Hebrew, the original Hebrew is so clunky and weird compared to English, but also lesbians aren't mentioned like at all until maybe in Romans.
Yeah.
So I've seen it argued that it's not lesbians that are being mentioned, but women who use anal sex as a way to sort of have a modicum of agency about what's happening to their body and their reproductive health, and then others who say that it is lesbians. But it's also, as Dan McClellan said, sometimes Paul is just wrong. I mean, on more than just that, but also the Greco-Roman philosophical movements of that time also influenced that. It wasn't Judaism. It was, some of it was Platonism and Stoicism that show up. And if you don't have, and I'm not anything like a scholar of Stoicism or Platonism, but I know that that's where the influences are. And if you don't have that context, well, then how in the world are you supposed to know what this 2,000-year-old text is saying?
Not only that, most people are not even aware that that word homosexual was not it's not anywhere to be found in the Bible until the 40s, the 1940s.
Yeah, most it wasn't a word until the late 19th century, right?
Yeah,
is that right?
That it wasn't even in the Bible. It was added. It was acknowledged that it was incorrect, and then it was, removed. But by that time, so many translations have been based off of that translation. Now it's just there, and now we deal with it as if it was originally in the text, and it wasn't. It was added in this country in the 1940s. Most Christians do not know that, and if you tell them that, they'll think you're lying.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and one of the best exercises anyone can do who's doubtful of what we're saying, to your point, December, is you can look up like Martin Luther's 1517 translation of the Bible in German and look up every clobber passage and see how he translates it. The word he uses is Nabenschatter. I don't know German well, but it means one who rapes children, which I actually don't think is what the Greek was talking about. But it's obviously clear that Martin Luther didn't think that this was two consensual men. You can see that in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, does not have any sort of mention of homosexuality, though there were 12 to 16 words in ancient Greek that referred to same-sex sexual relationships, never used. And then, so just a little study. If people would be a little bit more biblically literate, and the information is out there today, you can Google all of this stuff. Like, there's no excuse to not know better than just to parrot what your pastor says anymore.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when we talked about malakoi, that word, and everybody was like, all right, effeminate men, clearly that means gay. And she's like, no, it doesn't have anything to do with sexuality at all. It was more like they like to wear nicer clothes, maybe be, smell better than most ancient Near Eastern people smelled because, hygiene and all of that kind of thing. It didn't have anything to do. It was like more your broader definition of queer that, like standing out against the norm. And
there's even
to do with sexual orientation.
Based on Stoic and Stoic philosophy, there's even an argument made in a lot of Greek literature that malakoi refers to people who are morally weak, so it actually has nothing to do with could have nothing to do with expression at all. But people who, because in Stoicism, you were supposed to cut off all desire, which is why we see Paul saying, don't have sex at all. Like, Paul is heavily influenced by Stoicism because it was real men were supposed to be in complete control of their desires and not have sex, not eat lavish meals. The Stoic and Epicurean mindset was like, eat rice only, don't ever have sex, and that makes you a real powerful man. So a malakoi, exactly. But a malakoi as a soft one is somebody who wasn't able to do that. Namely, all of us would have been malakoi because who in the hell wants to live that life?
I mean, that the whole ascetic deny your body thing, it boggles my mind. I mean, life is short, y'all. Eat the pie, drink the beer if that's your thing. Dance the dance, have the sex.
Do it with consent. With consent.
With consent.
Consent is sexy and mandatory. One of the things about evangelical culture is purity culture, and this idea about sex before marriage is bad and all of that, and you push back against that in the book somewhat. But should Christians, queer or not, look to the ancient Near East for a sexual ethic for today, or is that misguided and silly and kind of stupid? Or
if you want a really kinky sexual ethic, then go back to the Greco-Roman world and you can get some crazy stuff from them. But I would say, to answer the question honestly, I mean, what's remarkable is that the Bible doesn't have a sexual ethic. There is no sexual ethic in the Bible, and it's contradictory. The thing I say in this book, which again is scholarly consensus, there's not a verse from Genesis to Revelation that condemns premarital sex. In fact, there's an entire book of the Bible, the Song of Solomon, that celebrates a unmarried couple having this lavish sexual relationship. And so, all of that to say, I don't think you can look to the Bible for a sexual ethic. And what I do in my book is I take one line from Paul, which actually comes from Stoic philosophy that I actually think is probably helpful. Paul says, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. And I think that's a great ethical for any social issue. You're permitted to have sex whenever you want, with whoever you want, consensually, fine. But the question you should be asking is this beneficial to me? Is this helpful and healthy to me and to the person I'm engaging with? That seems like a better, healthier, measured sexual ethic than don't have sex at all, telling kids, young adults to repress themselves. Like, of course, that's going to come out in unhealthy ways. Repression is never a good ethical paradigm. And so my hope in this book was to give people a permission slip to say, there is no black and white in or out rule around how to engage sexually, but you should be checking in with yourself and being mindful and being thoughtful about who you're engaging with, why you're engaging, and how. Yeah.
And as Elaine said, Boaz and Ruth were hot. I asked Dan after we got off the air, Ruth, did she? And he just started laughing. He knew exactly what I was talking about because of the uncovering of the foot. But there's some queer relationships in the Bible, and that'll blow some minds. We've talked about David and Jonathan on this show and on Tell Me Everything with John Fugelsang, which Dee and I do on Wednesdays. what are some of your favorite queer relationships or examples of queerness in the Bible? And if it's David and Jonathan, run with that. But
Yeah.
tell us about those.
Well, I just want to say at the start, I know when people hear that, they probably roll their eyes, because I rolled my eyes 10 years ago when I heard people trying to read gay relationships into the Bible. And I don't come to this topic lightly. I don't want to just read things into the scripture for the hell of it. But when I started doing my PhD, honestly, I began reading some of these ancient rabbinic texts about especially Hebrew Bible characters. And stories like Joseph, people will know him as Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Joseph who gets the coat of many colors. The rabbis, 1,500 years ago, were writing about this story as either a gay or a gender nonconforming young man who's given a garment that is in Hebrew called kenet pasim, which means women's garment. It's a gendered term. It means so he's wearing this garment given by his father that does not align with his gender, and ends up getting bullied and almost killed by his brothers for wearing it. But because his father supports him throughout the entirety of his journey, Joseph ends up being able to overcome the hatred and the oppression, and he becomes one of the great leaders of Israel. Like, that's one of the stories of the Hebrew Bible that has ample evidence from rabbinic writings that it has a queer connotation to it. And when I read that with that queer lens for the first time, it blew my mind, because what's actually more interesting about that story is not that Joseph is gender nonconforming, but that his father affirmed him in his gender nonconforming, gave him a garment that was not aligned with his gender, stood up for him against the oppression of his brothers. And I just thought, if we could only teach this in its actual context in our Sunday schools, how many parents could have been inspired to respond to their queer youth better?
Yes.
And there are so many of those stories. I highlight 5 of them in the book, but there are many more. And if people are interested in this in a real way, the Queer Bible Commentary is done by some of the best queer theologians in the world. And it goes through every book of the Bible, and it pulls out the things that are inherently queer from a historical contextual perspective from all over the Bible.
Yeah, that story kind of highlights one of the things that people like us know, is that there are inconsistencies in the canon, and that story happens before what they say in Deuteronomy about not wearing women's clothes. Men shouldn't wear women's clothes and vice versa. So again, not a consistent thing, but that did blow my mind. We did not talk about that in that class that I took. And when you pointed out what that word meant, I was like, holy crap, that changes the whole story. Like, if you know that that's what that word means, that radically alters the reading of it. And then the rabbinic, the texts that go along with that.
And I want to pause for a second too, and just say this is the exercise that I did in my mind. The conversations between, and I'm still grappling with this, the queerness of David and Jonathan, whether that's so or not. But here's one thing that's pushing me over the ledge with it. The conversations between those two are so romantic. If you, and this is for our listeners, I want to give everybody a homework assignment right quick. Go find these. Where are these verses exactly?
1 Samuel.
1 Samuel, yeah.
Okay,
I think
First
it's 8
Samuel.
or 18.
Okay, this is a homework assignment for you all. I want you to choose any woman's name, not your mother's, and replace Jonathan's name with any woman's name and read all those scriptures. Every time David says Jonathan, replace it with Samantha or whoever, Keisha, whatever you want to do. And listen to how David talks to Keisha, and then see how you feel about those conversations afterwards. And that's all I'm going to say.
Right.
When they talk about your love is better than a woman and all this and all that. And in your mind, replace Jonathan with a woman's name, and you see how you end up on the other end of that. That's the exercise that I did, and I was like, boy, these two was funny. And so I don't know what conclusion you gonna come to, but my conclusion was they go together real bad. Like we said,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? They was cool. They was homie lover friends. So, but y'all see how what you find on the other side for you. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
John Suarez said that I already did that in my tween year. You're way ahead of me. It took me a minute because I could, it takes a minute to reconcile what you believe with what you know and what you accept to be true.
Yeah.
So we evolve, because what you initially believe comes from those voices over the pulpit and who's training you, raising you, and teaching you, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you know is what you come to study, what you do when you do the soul work, when you do the reading, when you do the research, when you look at the historical context of scriptures, where they come from, the translations, the mistranslations, the intentional misrepresentations of scripture by the cisgendered heterosexual men that translated those, the ideology of their time, the context, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have to reconcile what you believe and what you know and decide what are you going to accept to be your truth. There's no judgment here. This is the no judgment zone. But you'll find that if you are committed to truth, you will evolve to an ever more accepting person as you go. If you're committed to truth, if you're committed to being right, who knows where you're going to land. But
Right.
if you're committed to truth, you're going to land in love. Every time.
And that's the whole thing right there. Love is the thing. And you point this out, Brandon, that love is kind of the ethic of Jesus. And I remember telling my first wife, who was a Southern Baptist, that the love of neighbor is what it boiled down to for me, and the golden rule. And she said, and I quote, "You're doing that hippie Bob Marley shit again." And I was like, I'm quoting Jesus. But also Bob Marley is very cool.
Yes.
But
yeah.
I'm quoting Jesus, and the fundamentalists still can't wrap their head around that, because it's about what you believe about Jesus, not how you enact what he taught in your own life. So as we start to wrap this up, Brandon, Orthodox Christianity, major league problems, as you said in the book. Why would we accept uncritically what some empire builders decided was orthodoxy? So where would you like to see Christianity go in a heterodox sort of way, in a queer heterodox way? And what does that look like in an ideal world where you're not waiting for the crumbs from the table?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have an answer to that question. I've been asked it a lot on this book tour. And all I've done is I've pointed people to an example.
Okay.
In New York, I hang out at this queer Jewish synagogue called Lab Shul. And it's this incredible, my friend Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavi founded it. His uncle is the chief rabbi of Israel. He was originally a drag queen, and then he became a rabbi. And what's so amazing about this community is that on high holy days, there are about 3,000 to 4,000 young Jews that come. They pay to go to these services, which is a wild thing, thinking from a Christian paradigm. And these services take place in a nightclub in Brooklyn. And it's this beautiful mix. It's traditional Judaism. They pray the prayers, they do the rituals, but it's also artistic. There are acrobats, and there are drag queens, and there's fun and drinking, and it's this reclaiming of the Jewish tradition for this group of people. Some are queer, some are not. That is saying we don't have to play by the rules. We're not interested. They call themselves a God optional community. They're like, you don't have to believe in anything to be here, but we want to make our tradition our own. And you can I encourage people to look up their website, Lab Shul. But I've been thinking for the past 5 years, how do we do that in Christianity? How do we take the best parts of the tradition that resonate for us, get rid of everything else, and then give ourselves the freedom to make our own unique expressions? That's a Brooklyn queer expression of Judaism, it's probably not going to work anywhere else in the world. I would love to see a Queens, New York queering expression of Christianity. I don't know what that looks like or how to do it, but I do know that there are communities all across this country where this kind of thing is happening. People are saying, we're done waiting for our denominations to bless us. We're going to do our own damn thing. And I think that's where the Spirit of God has always worked, on the margins of the institutions. That's where the Jesus movement began, outside of the institutions. And so I just think if you're interested in seeing what God is up to, look around outside of the churches and around the churches in your community, and I'm sure you will find some unique, life-giving, inspiring, new expressions of what it looks like to be Christian.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. I mean, if you can't party with God or no God, why bother? And if you can't look at the lens of love of neighbor and see the radicalness of that act of loving your neighbor as yourself, and that is the law and the prophets. It's all it's all there, right? Like, that's so radical. Brandan, thank you so much. Before we let you go, we're gonna end with a segment we call the Word on the Street. Typically, it might be something from a book of theology. It might be a poem. December might drop a spoken word every now and again. But Dee, what you got for us tonight before we let Brandan go?
Before we let you go, tonight the spoken word is the word on the street is coming from Brandan Robertson.
All right.
Out of chapter 33 of his book, How Should I Engage with Non-Affirming Christians? And I'm going to read from it directly. And I want you all to go get the book, whether you get it on Kindle or you get the hard copy. I'm a hard copy gal. I like to hold the book in my hand and fill the pages. So y'all go get the book, okay? It's awesome. Hopefully you can see that. So this is going to be the final word from Brandan Robertson, the Right Reverend queer Christian pastor, Brother Pastor Brandan Robertson. It says, almost all queer Christians have connections to non-affirming Christians in their lives. This poses a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities for each one of us. But at the end of the day, we must remember that Christians have always disagreed on all theological and ethical issues. We do not need to be in alignment with everyone who sees something differently than we do. Thankfully, we live in an era where there are thousands of queer inclusive churches, conferences, networks, and social groups where we can gather and live out our faith without always needing to give a defense for it. Praise God for that. That part was my part. What is most important is that you have a community of support that can encourage you and help you grow more deeply on your spiritual journey. And that is frankly very difficult to do with non-affirming people and in non-affirming churches. So seek out inclusive Christians and churches to be a part of. And know that regardless of what any Christian, pastor, or YouTube preacher might say, you are beloved of God and welcome, along with everyone else, to your rightful place at the table of God's grace. That is from the Right Reverend Brandan Robertson, and that is the word on the street.
That'll preach every Sunday.
Out of Queer and Christian, y'all go get that.
Every Sunday,
Thank you.
Will preach. Brandan, thank you so much for joining us and for writing this amazing book, for telling your story, and for just shining your light, which is very bright. I can see it all the way from here, where you're at, and you're in New York right now. Miami
right now, in the nice Miami heat. Woo!
Oh, wow. Okay. I feel for you because it's ugly and hot down there. But thank you again for coming on the show. And folks, get the book, Queer Christian, Reclaiming the Bible, Our Faith, and Our Place at the Table by Brandan Robertson, soon to be PhD Brandan Robertson.
Doctor, the Right Reverend Dr. Brandan Robertson.
From your mouth to God's ears. Amen.
Hallelujah. Amen. That's our show, folks. Tune in next week. Like, subscribe, share, etc., etc. We love y'all.
All the things. Go get the book, y'all.